Hi there, and thank you for joining us at Wilderness Wildlife Week. My name is Ben Montgomery, and I'm the author of Grandma Gatewood's Walk, the inspiring story of the woman who saved the Appalachian Trail. I'm very happy to be here in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. Last night I ate at a place called Mama's Country Kitchen, where $10 got me a chicken fried steak, a piece of fried chicken, a piece of ham, green beans, macaroni and cheese, fried okra, a bowl of gravy, 2 biscuits, and banana pudding. $10, a meal for one person. That's how everyone should eat. What a great place to be, Pigeon Forge. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Grandma Gatewood. In 1955, this woman named Emma Gatewood, who was the mother of 11, the grandmother of 23, the great-grandmother of 3. She told her family that she was going on a walk, and she disappeared. For all intents and purposes, she could have been gone for good. Now, I come from Florida, Tampa, Florida, and today we would issue what we call a silver alert if this ever happened, where they put the highway billboards say, be on the lookout for 5'2", 130-pound Emma Gatewood driving a Nissan Altima, something like that. That didn't happen back in 1955. In fact, nobody was really super concerned that she was gone, even though they didn't hear from her for 9 weeks. By the time they finally heard from her, it was via postcard, which she had dropped in the mail at Roanoke, Virginia, informing her children that she was hiking the Appalachian Trail, that she at that point had walked from Georgia, Mount Oglethorpe in North Georgia, to Roanoke, Virginia, and that she intended to hike the entire Appalachian Trail, which ran 2,050 miles from Oglethorpe in Georgia to Mount Katahdin in Maine, the longest footpath, uninterrupted footpath in America. At that point in time, the Appalachian Trail was virtually unheard of. It was not well known. It had only come together about 10 years before that. Nobody who planned the Appalachian Trail ever thought anybody would try to walk the whole thing in one fell swoop. In fact, that wasn't the idea. The idea was to build a footpath that was in close proximity to about 60% of the American population that would cluster along the eastern seaboard. The forefathers never thought it would be something that anybody would try to walk altogether. It was a way to get out into the wilderness, to take a good long hike without having to cross roads, without having to cross highways, to get alone in the woods, alone with your thoughts. And so in 1948, when a man named Earl Schaefer first completed what we call a through hike of the Appalachian Trail, walking the whole thing without stopping, nobody believed him. He sent word back to the Appalachian Trail outfit, then known as the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, that in fact he had hiked the whole thing, but they didn't believe him. They asked him to prove it. And so in order to prove it, he sent in his journals and he sent in photographs that he'd taken along the way. And Earl Schaefer became known as the first man to complete a solo through hike. And that was 1948. And around that time is when Emma Gatewood first learned of the Appalachian Trail. There was a National Geographic magazine, a feature story on the AT that ran in 1949 that created a very roseate picture of what it might take to walk 2,050 miles through the wilderness. It said anybody in moderate physical condition could hayfoot, strawfoot from Georgia to Maine. It said the trail was wide as a Mack truck and that there was food to be found all along the way. It made it seem pretty easy. Moderate physical condition is all it took. At some point in that era, Emma Gatewood came across this magazine article, probably in a doctor's office. She at the time was living in southeastern Ohio, and she set her mind on hiking the Appalachian Trail. The first time she tried was actually the year before, in 1954. She set off from Mount Katahdin, from the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail, trying to hike south and she made it only about 100 miles before getting lost in the woods of Maine. That might seem quaint. It was not. As recently as about 5 years ago, a woman got off trail in Maine and didn't survive. She lost her life in the wilderness. This is not all that uncommon. So when Emma Gatewood got lost, there within about 100 miles from the northern terminus, Mount Katahdin, she couldn't find the trail again. The woods were thick. She saw a biplane headed overhead, searching for her, it turns out. She tried to flag the plane down, but really had no way to bring attention to herself and to her plight. And at one point, she writes in her diary that she laid down and decided, if I'm going to die, this is as good a place to die as any. And she decided eventually to give it one last go, to try to find this trail. She's out of food. She had broken her glasses. She'd been bit on the eye by a black fly and caused her eye to swell up really bad. And she gave it one last go and eventually found the trail again and made her way back into a place called Rainbow Lake Camp. And there at Rainbow Lake, some of the park wardens who had been looking for her looked up. They were playing horseshoes at the time. They looked up and they saw this bedraggled 66-year-old woman walking in their direction. They recognized who she was. They knew that she had been lost in the woods for a few days, and they said, you need to go home, Grandma. This is no place for a woman your age. And she did. She sort of tucked her tail and she went back to Bangor, Maine, and looked at herself in the mirror. And she decided at some point that she was going to try it again. And the next time she was going to be successful. So the following year, she left from Mount Oglethorpe, walking north. They say it takes about 5 million steps to complete the Appalachian Trail. She at first wasn't going to tell anybody what she was doing. It was a secret because she thought that somebody was going to stop her. Somebody was going to recognize the danger of the situation or overestimate that danger and try to stop her. And if that wasn't the case, then somebody might try to bring her harm, assault a woman who was out there alone on the trail. So she kept it top secret. She ran into a lot of interesting situations right around here, around Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, when she came across, if you remember in that era, there was still a lot of back and forth between moonshiners and revenuers. A lot of moonshine run through these hills, and Emma Gatewood was walking right through the middle of all that. So there was an instance in which she approached a house because she saw some people out in the front yard and she needed a place to stay or maybe something to eat. And there was an old man sitting up on the porch and his wife was out in the field working. She approached the old man and introduced herself and said what she was trying to do. And he looked at her quizzically and said, "Did Washington send you?" He thought she was some kind of a spy dispatched on behalf of the federal government. She had to go into her bag to produce her papers and identifying documents to prove that she was who she said she was. And she was just hiking the AT. She carried on. She eventually told people because primarily she was interrupted on the trail by a newspaper reporter and a photographer near Roanoke who volunteered for the local trail club. And they knew how valuable this story was. They knew that people would want to read about it. And they convinced her to tell them who she was and what it was she was doing. And so when word got out in the Roanoke Times that morning, and by the way, she had sent a postcard home because she didn't want her kids to read about it in the newspaper before they heard from her firsthand. So when word got out, that first story was published. Boy, it spread like wildfire across the country until eventually newspaper reporters across the United States were writing about, as they called her, Grandma Gatewood or Granny Gatewood. And a lot of Americans started to pull for her with hopes that she would complete this task. She pressed on. There were a couple of things that happened that were very interesting. In the summer of 1955, 2 hurricanes made landfall off the coast of North Carolina, pretty much back to back, about 6 or 7 days apart. And they both took essentially the same track, south to north, right up the eastern seaboard, dumping unprecedented amounts of rain on New York and New England, killing 211 people, causing somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 billion in damage. uprooting coffins from cemeteries. Rivers escaped their banks. And Emma Gatewood was out there alone on the Appalachian Trail. I should mention also that she was completely unprepared for, at least gear-wise, for what she faced. If you've ever spent any time on the Appalachian Trail, then you know that we do a lot of thinking on the front end about what we take with us. We buy the best backpacks, and you can pay in the neighborhood of $500 for a backpack if you want. We buy the best tents. I just bought one not long ago for $498 for a 3-man tent, lightweight, beautiful graphite tent poles. We buy really fantastic sleeping bags that are lightweight and keep us warm at night. She had none of this stuff. She brought with her a denim drawstring sack that she slung over her shoulder, which you see in this photograph here. She had made that sack herself at home. And in that sack, she stuffed an army blanket. She had a gingham dress that she could shake out in the event she walked through a town. She wanted to look proper. Should be mentioned, she was a genteel, farm-reared white woman from southeastern Ohio, but she wanted to look nice if she walked through town. She didn't want anybody to mistake her for a hobo. She brought with her no tent, no sleeping bag, nothing really to cook with. She brought some bouillon cubes to suck on for the sodium. She brought occasionally some peanuts and raisins and powdered milk, all for the nutrients, and set about hiking 2,050 miles. So if you can imagine these 2 hurricanes blow in, she was often out there exposed. The only thing to protect her from the rain that she had was a plastic shower curtain, and this was the only thing to keep her dry, and it didn't do the job, as you might imagine. She was constantly getting soaked, and she would write in her journal, slogged 9 miles through wind and rain today. All my stuff is wet. So she had a heck of a time during that experience. One interesting anecdote that I like to tell, she was nearing a place called Clarendon Gorge in New England, and she had spent the night before with a couple of young men who were 18 and 19 years old, and they were both on leave from the Navy in Annapolis, Maryland, and they had come down to spend some time hiking and fishing and camping on the Appalachian Trail. And she spent a night with them and woke up the next morning and started off before they did. And she made it to Clarendon Gorge, and the rain had come so strong the day before that the river was at flood stage. There was no safe way for her to cross. The pedestrian footbridge that connected one side to the other had actually been washed away. And so she walked upstream and downstream trying to find some way to achieve safe passage, and couldn't figure it out. And so she sat down on the banks of this gorge and waited for these 2 young men to come along. When they finally did, she told them her predicament, and they decided in all their youthful wisdom that they would just tie her between them. If you can imagine this in your head, they would strap her using parachute cord in between them, strap themselves all together, and they would make their way across this river on their own. And this is what they did. And Emma wrote in her diary that she didn't want to look down. She was so scared, and the water eventually creeped up about to her neck, flood stage water. But they took baby steps, very carefully, very slowly across the river, and got across. When she hit the other side, of course, she untied herself and said, "Well, boys, you got Grandma across. Thanks very much." And she grabbed her stuff and she took off up the trail. Now, that might seem like a quaint story. Think about it in 1955, but I contacted one of the men. I actually talked to both of the men involved as I was reporting this book a few years ago. And Robert Sargent was one of the men. He lives down in Sarasota, Florida, not far from me. And I introduced myself to him on the telephone. I told him I was working on a book about Grandma Gatewood, and I had found his name written in her journal. And I relayed to him that anecdote that she had accounted for in this sort of humorous way in her diary, her trail journal. And I said, "Do you remember that?" And he said, "Ben, I can't forget that because I still to this day have nightmares about it. was that impactful an event for him that he still had nightmares about this experience. She pressed on, had another interesting meetup with some young men on the Green Trail in Vermont. She also in rain conditions, hurricane conditions, she approached a shelter that was occupied, as she wrote in her journal, by 8 African-American boys and their 2 white leaders from a Catholic parish in Harlem. And she wrote that she didn't want to stay there that night. It was a little crowded, and so she pressed on, but she hit another flood stage stream, and it worried her, and so she turned back and walked back to the shelter that was occupied by these Catholic boys from Harlem. And she slept there that night. And this is 1955. This is a year after, a year after Brown versus Board of Education. Same year, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on that bus in Montgomery. Elvis Presley had just come out with Heartbreak Hotel right around that same time. So a lot going on in American history, and a lot of racial tension in the South and up the Appalachian chain. And so if you could imagine for a second this white woman laying down to sleep with 8 African-American boys, and she wrote in her journal that she had a hard time falling asleep because the boy who was sleeping next to her kept throwing his arm over her shoulder, and she would move it back and he would throw it back over. But she eventually got to sleep, and the next day they all walked out together, and when they reached that flood stage creek together, Emma rode on the back of one of these strapping young men across the river, and they got to safety on the other side. And that's sort of all that she accounted for in her diary. But I tracked down the rest of that story, and it turns out the summer of '55 was very violent in Harlem. And this was a story left behind by one of those white Catholic leaders. He was a young seminarian in his early 20s, working for a parish in Harlem. And the bloodshed was so intense, and the fight for turf among certain street gangs in Harlem was so intense in the summer of '55 that one of the leaders of the church decided it would be a good idea if these 2 young Catholic priests would identify the 4 head honchos of these 2 rival street gangs and take them on an all-expense-paid trip to the Green Mountains of Vermont in order to try to broker the peace. And this was these were the boys that Emma Gatewood slept with. They weren't Catholic boys from Harlem. They were, the 4 head honchos, the 8 head honchos, these 2 rival gangs. She pressed on. She eventually crested Mount Katahdin. By the time she did, in late September, she had sprained her knee. She had broken 1 lens out of her glasses, and she was virtually blind without her glasses. She didn't have the proper gear, but she plowed ahead. As she always said, it takes more heart than heel. And she made it to the top of Mount Katahdin, September 26, 1955, all by herself. At this point, she was celebrated worldwide, countrywide. There'd been a feature story about her in Sports Illustrated magazine, which was 1 year old in 1955. People were pulling for her. Editorials were written about her. She crested Mount Katahdin, and she sang the first verse of America the Beautiful. And she said, "I've done it. I said I'd do it, and I've done it." And she turned around and walked back down, and she was celebrated by reporters who met her at the bottom of the mountain and wrote stories about her and about this incredible human accomplishment. A lot of those reporters said that she was a widow. A lot of them asked her, "Why did you do this?" And she, in some cases, lied through her teeth. This was a woman who was a teetotaler, who, cared for her children, who was a hard worker. But she said, "I did it because, I said I'd do it." She said, "I did it because I wanted to see what was over the hill and then what was over the one beyond that." She said, "I did it on a lark." She said, "I don't really like rocking chairs." And again, she described herself as a widow. And as it turns out, her ex-husband, was alive and well back in southeastern Ohio. And something that nobody really knew that she never really talked about, that nobody really talked about, even though she was celebrated and was written about a lot, was that She was married for about 30 years to an abusive, oppressive, hard-fisted man named P.C. Gatewood, who beat her over and over and over again throughout the 30 years that they were married. I spoke with 4 of her living children, 4 who were alive when I started writing this book. And all of them had memories of PC's abuse, how he would take advantage of her, how at one point he had convinced a justice of the peace that she was crazy, and she was arrested and spent a night in jail. Theirs was a violent relationship on his part, but she overcame all that. And what I came to learn in reporting this book was that that abuse was difficult for her, but when she finally filed for divorce in 1941 and finally achieved her own freedom, her own independence, she began to love the woods, to love the solitude. And the woods were always a haven for her. When she would run from him, she would run and hide out in the woods. And so this was, she didn't view nature, the outdoors, as something to be afraid of. She viewed it as a bit of a haven. And this set her on the course to become, one of the most famous pedestrians in American history. She didn't stop in 1955. In 1957, again, she was bored. She didn't like when her children dropped her grandchildren off out of the blue and asked her to babysit. That wasn't appealing to her. And so she stitched another drawstring sack and hit the Appalachian Trail again in 1957. This time she had more fun. She had met so many people along the way on the first trip, and she had kept their names and corresponded with them in the intervening year, that they expected her return in 1957. And so people were looking for her. They would help her out with food. They would invite her to the dinner table. And it was a much better experience for her. On that trip, she laid down in the woods once. Funny little story. She took a nap in the woods. When she woke up, there were 3 buzzards standing shoulder to shoulder right beside her. And she turned and looked at them, and she said, "Well, I'm not dead yet." And they all took off. She hiked the trail, completing a through hike the second time, 1957, becoming the first person to ever complete 2 through hikes of the Appalachian Trail. She kept walking, and by 1959, she wanted a new challenge, and she hiked the Oregon Trail from Independence, Missouri to Portland, Oregon, which is a total of about 2,000 miles. And that was completed when she was 71 years old. She kept stitching together another complete hike of the Appalachian Trail and finished that in 1964, becoming the first person to ever hike the Appalachian Trail 3 times. And that was a record that would stand for several decades. Out of all of her hiking, her favorite place was to walk through on a 6-mile stretch of a trail through Hocking Hills State Park in southeastern Ohio. And upon her death, that stretch of trail became known as the Grandma Gatewood Trail. And maybe some of you all have been there before. If you haven't, it's a really special hike, and you should make an effort to get out there, especially in the wintertime. She led a winter hike. It happens in late January every year, right up until her death. And this is a picture of her somewhere in that area. And the slides I wish this slide was at first, because that gives you a sense of the length of the AT and exactly what that looks like. This is not an easy task. And having hiked about 400 miles of the Southern Appalachian Trail, I can tell you it's, with the best gear, with great shoes and so forth. It's always a difficult thing. One note about shoes, and my friend Anne Van Curen is going to tell you probably a little bit about that. Grandma Gatewood wore Keds for the most part. Every once in a while she's photographed in Chuck Taylors, but she liked canvas shoes because she had terrible bunions, and she needed her shoes to be a little bit flexible so that her feet weren't all bunched up. And she blew through about, what was it, Anne? About 7 pairs of Keds on that first trek, which is pretty intense. She just went right through them. And how are we doing on fantastic. So I'm going to turn it over now to Anne Van Curen, who is my friend, and Anne has put together a wonderful presentation. And actually, Anne isn't here. I made a mistake about that. This is Emma Gatewood in the flesh. So please welcome Anne Van Curen. Flash Emma Gatewood.
Thank you, Tommy. Thank you. Yeah. Well, am I ready? All righty. Howdy, folks. Howdy. Yeah, I'm right proud to be here today. Thank you for having me. Well, this great nephew of mine, Benny done told you this story, and I'm so proud that he done went and wrote a book about me. Yeah, this year National Geographic is what got me interested, what got me started. Yeah, and it was, I was in the doctor's office waiting on him to call me back when I picked this here thing up and looked at it, August of 1949. It's a bit outdated, but I'm glad he didn't get rid of this here magazine because, I started reading it and my goodness, I was captivated. I took this magazine here home with me and started doing a little research, and I figured that it sounded like there's all men that done hike this thing through. I was wanting to be the first woman to hike it through. So I started figuring out, I practiced sleeping in the backwoods, and I was living with my son Nelson at the time. So I started walking a lot and got to where I was about 10 miles a day through the neighborhood. The back of my legs was hurting. When I decided what I would do, you see, is go on up there in Maine, Mount Katahdin, where it starts, and hike south, because I figured I'd be walking downhill the whole way. That was likely so. I didn't. I did start up there in July of that 1954, but them black flies was so big, and I was swatting them flies and knocked my glasses off. Well, I'm blind as a bat without my glasses, and I did get twisted and turned around, and hard to see the white stripes, and finally did walk into a campfire where them Baxter State Park Rangers was, and they said, "Grandma, you're lost." I said, "I am not lost. I was just misplaced." Well, they were not impressed. They got me on the bus back to my Ohio home, and I figured I'd work a little more on trying to figure out this hike. I hadn't told too many people about that first attempt. And so I got home, and I figured maybe the next year I'd start a little earlier, and I'd start down south and work my way up. So I got on a plane and flew to Atlanta, and from there, in a sweet little town, I got a bus to Jasper, pretty little Georgia town, and then got a taxi cab ride up to Mount Oglethorpe, where the Appalachian Trail started. Now, no one a soul knew where I was except the taxi cab driver and my cousin. If I told one of my 11 children where I was at, well, one of them might have stopped me. So anyway, I got up there on the mountainside, and I tipped that taxi cab fella a good tip, and made sure I had my dungarees on, and whew, I was so happy to be out there in the woods. I looked. My goodness, there was views spectacular, 1,000 views over them North Georgia mountains to see, and whew, looked like 1,000 spectacular ways I could die up there too. But them Georgia mountains are tall. The first night on the trail, the farmhouse not too far off the trail knocked on the door, and the Miller family let me come in, and they fed me and let me sleep there that night. I thought, this is going to be all right. Well, by the next night, I was up on one of them tall Georgia ridges, and there wasn't nowhere to sleep. But I got my shower curtain and got lots of leaves under it and settled down. And then I started hearing this scratching, and I looked around, and sure enough, here's a big old mouse sitting on my chest. He looked at me. We was looking eyeball to eyeball, two fearless creatures out there in the wood. I didn't see too many people in Georgia. It wasn't till I got to Tennessee and Newfound Gap where I saw them, there was people. There was even a bus that took folks down into Gatlinburg, and I got what I needed there in Tennessee. That's where I saw my first pink dogwood. Well, and one thing I carried with me was my notebook and pen, and I'd take time every day to journal a little bit. And it'd been nearly a month. Children still had no idea where I was. And but as I zigzagged between North Carolina and Tennessee, I was tired and thirsty, but I was just planting me a crop full of memories and exploring the world and in my own mind. And it just felt so good to be out there moving. I wrote in my little book of the challenges and rewards of wild dogs that sometimes would show up at night, and I had to keep a fire burning to keep them away. And some of them cold nights when I'd get the stones hot and then lay them out around me so I could stay warm. And every now and then there'd be people show up on the trail, and I'd get a talking to them. In fact, I did a little too much talking by the time I hit Virginia. I was flapping my jaws too much, and this fella, I'd gone down into Black Horse Gap to get some supplies, and a car pulled up. Mr. McLeach, he got out and he says, "Miss Emma, we want to do a story about you." I said, "No, sir, you will not. I don't want the folks knowing where I'm at and whatnot." He said, "Well, I can get your pack carried for you up here, this nice cabin down, and give you a night to stay." And I thought, well, we might be talking now. So he got his camera that night, and I posed, grinning through my false teeth. And this is what he said. And it was the 48th day when he finally got me to talking in the Roanoke Times. Ohio woman, 67, hiking 2,050 miles on the Appy Trail. A hearty soul would cringe, but this 67-year-old great-grandma from Ohio, Georgia, enjoys it. She'll accept rides to nearby towns if she's taken back to the trail where she's left off. The Ohio widow woman has 26 grandchildren and 3 great-grands, and she's heading north to the James River. Well, the news was out. From Los Angeles to New York City, folks would be interrupting me, and reporters intercepting me and asking how I was doing and why I was walking. And I figured by now I better let my family know where I was at. I got me some postcards and put them in the mail. Now they know what I meant when I said I was going out for a walk. Yeah, it was 1937 by the time Appalachian Trail finally got finished. Benton McKay and his friend Avery, they've been working on it for many years. And finally right here in Gatlinburg, they got together and said, "It's ready. You folks can get out and walk on it." But you know, by that time, folks were salivating over automobiles. And then World War II comes around, and then lo and behold, something else came along that interrupted everybody, and that's the television set. In the 50s, here comes them television sets, and half of the folks had a TV they were sitting looking at, and those youngins, they'd sit on the tail and watch their TV instead of getting out and walking around on the soles of their feet, seeing what was happening. But I guess folks did think I was a curiosity out there walking up the side of the country. But let me get off my soapbox and get us back on the trail here. I'd hit Virginia. Oh, and that's Shenandoah, valley was so fine. Met a couple of Boy Scout troops, just as, oh, there's fine fellas. Had a big time with them. And then one morning early, I was making good time. I was heading up there fast and following the blazes, when all of a sudden, right in front of me was this huge gate with barbed wire all around the top of it. And there was a big apparatus right in the center of this area. And I said, well, I can see the stripes on them trees right through that gate. What is going on? Folks aren't going to interrupt me here. So what I did, I looked around till there was a low area of barbed wire, and I grabbed my pack. I just grabbed it and threw it over and then jumped down myself into that area. Well, all of a sudden my feet hit the floor, and you know what? There was 12 uniformed men walking straight at me. You see, I didn't realize it, but we're in the midst of that Cold War, and the United States had built these apparatuses to man the air for attacks. They didn't realize an old grandma might be coming in the back door to attack them. Those fellas, oh, they helped me out and got me on the right path again. And I just shook my head as I headed back, left them. I hit Harpers Ferry, and oh my goodness, I remember going out and sitting on a ledge there when the trail carried me up to this beautiful overlook, and I just sat and thought about all the history that had gone on along the trail, and just was amazed at all of our country had been through. Harpers Ferry was a special place. And then I finally got to the George Washington Monument State Park. Don't know if you've ever been there, but yeah, I got in there, was sitting looking at George Washington, and here taps a fellow on my shoulder, says, "Are you Miss Gatewood?" I said, "Well, I am, but I'm a park ranger here, and there's somebody that wants to talk to you." Oh, I followed him back to the ranger station, and more people to interview me. This is now Boonesboro, Maryland, July the 8th. I did not know what all the fuss was about. And they say after 66 days and nearly 1,000 miles, Miss Emma Gatewood's pretty determined to become the first woman ever to hike the AT alone, even if she is a 67-year-old widow woman. The rate she's going, she'll make it there to Maine in September, lugging a pack of 35 pounds and spending the nights in a sleeping bag or sort of lean-to shelter along the way. She's worn out 2 pairs of shoes, but none of her enthusiasm. Well, they got most of it right. Although my bag, it never did weigh 35 pounds. No, and I didn't know if I was going to make it to Maine or not in September. People didn't stop interrupting me. And then there's one other thing they didn't quite get right. Yeah, they kept writing about me being a widow woman. And that's what I told them. It's just easier to tell them that. I met P.C. Gatewood and married him when I was 18 years old. And he was a eligible bachelor there. In fact, he was the only fellow in Idaho County that graduated college. He was a few years my elder, and he was a school teacher. But not only did he have lots of education, he had a bad temper, and I never knew, and just like that, it's going to flare. And we'd been married about 3 months. I just found out I was expecting the first time he hit me hard, and I knew I ought to go back to Mama. But my mama, she's raised 15 young'uns herself, and I couldn't go show up on her step with a baby. So, but I knew finally did have to do something. 11 kids, 31 years later. My son Nelson was 15, still living at home, and he helped me. He helped me, and I got out, and I stayed in the backwoods long enough to feel free enough to come home, and there's a sheriff and his wife in town. that took pity on me and helped me too to end my marriage with PC. And I didn't tell many folks about that. I wasn't going to tell folks I was a divorcee and then be out walking around in the countryside. It's just easier to tell them I'm a widow woman, but y'all, I share that with you just because maybe now you know why I just feel safe in the woods. And some kind of balm come to my soul just listening to them birds sing and seeing the flowers at my feet. Feeling almost like I was in a cathedral some mornings when I'd wake up. But let me get back here to the trail. I'm getting sidetracked again. Yeah, I made it to Pennsylvania. Woo, that's a hard state, 230 miles of it. I remember walking one day in Pennsylvania and heard some rattling behind me, turned around, there's a big old fella walking up, says, "Hey, you Miss Gatewood?" I said, "Well, I am." He said, "I'm a bird watcher, and I want to know what kind of birds you done seen on the trail." We sat down for probably 2 or 3 hours talking about the birds we done seen on the trail. Fine fella. Yeah, and I made it to New Jersey. Is when I got there, there's a police car. I was down in one of the little towns getting some grub, and a police car came up beside me. I said, "Have I done something wrong? Am I jaywalking?" And he says, "Miss Gatewood, need you to come back to the office with me." Didn't know what for. Got there, and on the telephone was a lady by the name of Mary Snow from Sports Illustrated magazine. She said, "Miss Emma, can I walk with you? Part of your walk?" I said, "Well, sure, honey." She walked with me in New York. We went across the Hudson River Valley together, and she just talking and chatting and asking questions. But yeah, I tell you one thing: when it rains, it does pour. In 1955, above and beyond anything that they've recorded, the storms, Connie and Diane right behind her, one little Massachusetts town that I walked through, and 2 days later, 200 folks had died from that flood that washed up. And you folks that hike, you know how it is hiking in the rain. And you're walking along, and the trail turns into a river. And the riverbed it can turn into just like that, almost like an ocean. And yes, and then in New England, I think Benny, he told you about some of the folks that helped me there. Yeah, I didn't realize it was a gang from Harlan that they came together over old grandma to help her across the river. And sure enough, I was riding on the young boy's back, riding piggyback to get across the river. And yes, the Navy boys, when I got to that one area where the river was so bad and I knew I couldn't get across no how, I looked up and here them Navy boys come walking down the trail. And when they got that parachute cord out to put around them, and then me in the middle, and the second boy is down here on the end. It was so high. The water was so high up to our chest, and just didn't know if one of us fell, we'd all been gone. But we did make it across the river, and I wondered what on earth is a 67-year-old grandma finding herself caught in a mess like this. And you know, those young men, every now and then I'd get a postcard from them, and they'd say, in years to come, they'd say, "Remember our Emma sandwich." Yeah, finally made it up to New Hampshire. Whew, that's a hard state, them mountains up there. And it was in New Hampshire that I tell you one thing, there's a sweet little Girl Scout troops that I met and got to spend some time with. And that just thrilled my soul. In Hanover, New Hampshire, there was, I'd gone down into the town and was getting a few supplies, and there was two little girls playing tennis. And I asked them, I said, honey, can you tell me where I might could eat? Where's a good restaurant? They said, hey, in my house. You come home with us. I said, I can't do that, said Mama's frying chicken. I said, well, maybe I can. So I followed them home, and we had a good time, and I met the mamas fixing to leave. And as I was leaving, their daddy came home, and he looked at me, comes up and shakes my hand. He says, wait right there. He ran in the house, came back, and showed me the magazine of the Sports Illustrated there where I was on. Oh, my goodness. Another family I met in New Hampshire was the Thompson family. Had three little boys. And I stopped, and they fed me a good supper, and I got to be good friends with the wife. And come to find out a few years later, Mr. Thompson became the governor of New Hampshire and served for several terms. Yeah. And finally, I'll never forget the night in September that I hit the 14th state. And there wasn't no fanfare, there wasn't no crowd welcoming me in at the state line. It was just a nice bed of moss welcomed me to lie down. And I laid my old sore bones down, took off my shoes, had bunions the size of marbles. Oh, lousy day. And I looked up at the sky, and have you ever looked up when the stars make you feel so important that you could almost touch them, and they're so close, and yet you feel so insignificant all at once. And I looked and thought about all the folks I've done met over the past weeks and months, and I could see the little young'uns sitting in front of their kitchen table, cutting newspaper articles out about Grandma Gatewood, or sitting in front of the TV at night, watching me traipse across the bottom of the TV news screen. And I just somehow felt like all of the United States was cheering on Grandma Gatewood along as I reached that last state. And boy, I needed some cheering, because I fell, and I sprained my ankle and bummed up this old knee, broke my glasses again, so I was once again half blind, stumbling up the walkway where little sweet Mary Snow from Sports Illustrated met me up there in Maine, and she took my glasses to be fixed. And I finally got to the sign for Mount Katahdin, and yes, I put my pack down, and I touched that sign there and leaned against it and sang out loud, America the Beautiful. Because you know what? It was a beautiful place for me. Yeah, I just had met folks from way down south to all the way up north, and they was extra nice to me. Some of them didn't let me in the house to stay, but lots of them did, and we swapped all kinds of good howdies. You know what? My daddy always said, Emma, if there's something you want to do, then pick up your feet high and go do it, girl. So you set your own goals, and don't forget to pick up your feet high.
Yeah,
Sure.
Yay, Anne. So
I'll
good.
grab my chair over here.
We're happy to take some questions from you now. Anne and I both. She knows the story better than I do, as you can clearly see.
Oh no, you got the story out there for all of
So
us.
how many times a year do you do that?
Pre-COVID,
Yeah.
I've been to 5 states now, and probably 12 or so times a year at least, hoping to work my way up all the states, all 14, carrying her story.
Well, if you know anybody who could use a Grandma Gatewood storyteller, holler at Anne Van Curen. That's just wonderful. I like it every time I see it. Do we have any questions rolling in? No questions. Are you kidding? Maybe we can tell some stories. Here's my favorite story about Emma Gatewood that didn't make it in the book, and I don't even know if I've told you this yet. She, because I didn't learn it until I met another relative of hers a little later on, after the book had already come out. But he was a nephew, and he was stationed in the Panhandle of Florida with the military. And Emma came to visit, he and his wife. And the first thing they did was take Emma, his Aunt Emma, to an all-you-can-eat seafood buffet. And they all went out to eat. And he said that they went up to the buffet and they loaded up their plates with peel and eat shrimp. And they brought the plates back to the table, and they all kind of sat down. They were pretty hungry. And they sat down and went to town on the peel and eat shrimp. And he said by the time he looked up, Emma, who was sitting across the table, had completely cleaned her plate. And there's not a tail or a shell in sight. He and his wife had been discarding the shells and the tails like we do in a bowl on the table, but she had eaten everything. And he said, well, Aunt Emma, she was a frugal woman, but he said, Aunt Emma, we normally discard the shells and the tails. And without missing a beat, she said, why, we paid for them, didn't we? So she had eaten them on purpose. Oh, great.
Oh, honey, I got a list of what I packed. I got Vienna sausage, raisins, peanuts, bouillon cubes to suck on, powdered milk, a tin of Band-Aids, a bottle of iodine, bobby pins, jar of Vicks salve to rub on my chest at night, warm coat and a shower curtain, drinking water and a Swiss Army knife, flashlight, candy mints, my pen and my notebook, and those slippers and gingham dress. I didn't wear them too often. I packed them, but I didn't wear them too often. Never saw one on that first trip. The whole way in 1955 did not see a bear. Now the second trip in 57, I did see a bear. And I hollered at him, as I think is my right. That's right. And he sauntered on his way.
Yeah. And I always heard the story that she encountered a much larger bear somewhere in the Northwest on that hike of the Oregon Trail. And in fact, it may have been a grizzly. And she pulled out her umbrella and just sort of fanned her umbrella in the bear's direction, and this was enough to frighten the bear off. This is the stories that my mother told me, when I was a kid. Fine question. I'll take this one, Anne. I would say do some reading. Start by reading Grandma Gatewood's Walk for your motivation, but there are some other books that you can read that'll help you get prepared. And then, I think what Emma Gatewood said, it is more an effort of the spirit than anything else. If you want to do it, you can do it, and you will figure it out as you go. There's lots of advice out there about what to take. There are Facebook groups about, through hiking and section hiking. There's a big, very involved website called whiteglaze.net with tons of advice. There's Backpacker Magazine and Backpacker Light Magazine, and on and on and on. But I think, if you're serious about that, start walking. If you don't right now, if that's not part of your lifestyle, then, make an effort to walk about 10 miles or 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day, get yourself used to it. And, we did, my kids and I did 400 miles. I had a great time doing that. on average walked about 12 miles a day. So that, you know, at one point in my life might have seemed like a very long way, but when you're doing it day after day after day, you become pretty used to it. And it's a very enjoyable experience.
This question for you. Were you ever afraid while you were alone on the trail?
If I was afraid, honey, I would not have gotten out there to begin with. No. No.
I think the one time that I came across any kind of indication that she was a little worried about her predicament was, do you remember this in the book, Anne, when Emma got a ride in Connecticut and the guy was drinking?
Yes, the fella wanted me to hop in the car with him, and he'd been drinking, and I was trying to get some new shoes.
That's right.
And I needed some new shoes bad down there in that little town. He said his wife would meet me at the intersection and help me to find some shoes if I'd go on with him, and I did. But yes, I was scared, Sonny, on that time. Yeah, you're right. Woo, lots of snakes. And a rattlesnake that bit me on my dungarees. Most of the time you could get your hiking stick and kind of shoo them away, but that one there was a mean feller.
I'll just read one little passage that I especially enjoy, straight out of Emma's diary late in life, and this was from May 19th, 1967. So help me with the math on this. She would have been 70. Was she born? I'm sure. Was she born in 1898? So she would have been 71 in 67, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
I took a mattock and shovel and worked the road around the court. She's back home now, and she's running a trailer court. I took a mattock and shovel and worked on the road around the court. Dug a ditch to let the water out and dug the high places into the holes. Lifted the grass around where the well was dug and wheeled 5 loads of dirt and filled it in. Then put the sod back and watered it down and beat it down with the shovel. Put the block of walk back in place. Spaded and planted 2 hills of cukes, 2 of pumpkins, 4 of peanuts. Put a fence around to keep the rabbits out. Burned the trash. Got some asparagus down the track and picked lettuce and a few strawberries. Went to the post office, fixed the underpinning, and now I'm tired. This is 71 years old, doing all that. No more questions?
I'll end with a poem, if I may. This is one that I just found and loved, and I carried it with me on the trail. I think perhaps written by Harold Allen. Talks about the trail. It says it's remote for detachment, narrow for chosen company. It's winding for leisure and lonely for contemplation. The trail leads not merely north and south, but upward to the body, the mind, and soul of man.
Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.